Jesus Never Existed by Kenneth Humphreys, audiobook version. Chapter 8, second section, Heart of Darkness, Christianity and the Dark Age. Rome had been able to resist, defeat, and conquer barbarians for 1,000 years. What was different after the triumph of Christianity? Thanks to Constantine's religious revolution and the establishment of a state-endorsed Christian church, the manpower that might have defended the empire was drawn increasingly into the ranks of the priesthood. The church offered the officer class an alternative career to that of the marching camp or frontier garrison, one superior in rewards of status, wealth, and power, and all in safety and comfort. Not for nothing did the church model its hierarchy on that of the army. It was a fine career for a bright young Roman who preferred to fight the hordes of Satan to the horsemen of Germany or Asia. The example was set from the top, where the Christian bishops established mind control over the weak and superstitious scions of dynastic monarchy. Most of the 4th century emperors had little in common with the military strongmen who had frequently seized power a century earlier. The feeble sons of Constantine were followed by the equally feeble sons of Valentinian and Theodosius. Tutored from infancy by scheming churchmen, these vicious and pious adolescent emperors essentially waged civil war on their own subjects. The one bright exception, Julian, who jettisoned his purported Christianity the moment he became Augustus, was assassinated, probably by a Christian soldier, within 3 years. The Roman patrician class moved wholesale into the higher ranks of the church when financial penalties made it prudent and penal legislation made it imperative to abandon paganism. By and large, the bishops of Western Europe were the old Roman aristocracy, wearing a new hat. With imperial approval, the church expropriated for its own purposes more and more of the wealth of the empire. Yet ultimately, it became indifferent to the fate of the empire. Holy Mother Church was all that mattered. With the willingness of the Roman elite to engage the invader seriously eroded, the only alternative defender was the hired barbarian, one under increasingly autonomous tribal chiefs. When these mercenaries failed, the enemy was bribed into a temporary quiescence. A degenerate age used the accumulated wealth of a millennium to buy time, and then spent that time on building a plethora of churches, on convening protracted councils to resolve hair-splitting nuances of theology and to the persecution of internal dissent. Scapegoat sacrifice, blaming the barbarians. Quote, real-life barbarians were eager to settle down and savour the fruits of civilization, to defeat the enemy, tax him, visit his doctors, marry his daughters. Robert Wright, Non-Zero, The Logic of Human Destiny. The Christians have always lied, and one of their biggest lies remains that of blaming the barbarians for the destruction of ancient civilization, which they themselves caused. The melodrama is familiar enough. Barbarians pouring in, Rome sacked, havoc wreaked everywhere, words like horde and onslaught are bandied about, conjuring up images of a human flood of bloodthirsty and predatory warriors, hell-bent on rape and pillage. The only light, we are asked to believe, comes from the flickering lamps of Christian monks in remote fastnesses, keeping alive the dim flame of civilization until a bright new dawn, centuries into the future. But the classic image of rape and pillage hides the insidious and corrosive influence of the Church on several generations of weak-minded Roman princes. It is now clear that the migrating tribes, often desperate and on the verge of starvation, had a code of morality and humanity superior to the degenerate Romans. With wagons and cattle, their movement was less of a, quote, onslaught than a pitiful trek. To put things in perspective, in 410, the Visigoths of Alaric, a Christian, actually pillaged Rome for 3 days before withdrawing. A generation later, in 455, Gaiseric, a Christian, and his Vandals spent just 14 days in the city, taking what they could. The conventional wisdom is a travesty written by the winning side. The barbarians in the 3rd and 5th centuries, like the barbarians of the 1st century AD or 2nd century BC, had wanted a share of the good life, not the common ruination of everyone. What was different in the age of Constantine and Theodosius compared to the age of Augustus and Hadrian was the degenerate nature of the Roman state which opposed them. The barbarians, in the passage of centuries, had learnt from the empire the practical skills of agriculture and horticulture, the value of armour, the exercise of power within a framework of law, even a version of the new Christian religion of the Romans. But the empire, for its part, had turned in on itself, had wasted its energies on the indulgences of a theocratic tyranny, had narrowed its vision, had ruined itself, a process that began with Constantine and his plans of a Christian dynasty. The assault upon paganism. Most of the 5th century emperors were remarkably young, an inevitable consequence of combining the notion of hereditary monarchy with the principle that violence was a legitimate instrument of policy. Spending their days at court, replete with wig and face makeup, the simple-minded young monarchs, with a bishop at their ear, displayed their martial prowess by issuing increasingly vindictive edicts against heretics and unbelievers. At a time when a regeneration of the legions was most urgent, the church-state apparatus devoted ever more resources to the persecution of its own people. Bishop Ambrose, in particular, guided no fewer than 4 monarchs, all of whom were complicit in the disintegration of the Western Empire, as they laboured tirelessly, but in luxury, over such pressing issues as to whether Christ was actually God and just how virtuous was virginity. The provinces were taxed into destitution, the soldiers went unpaid, and barbarian raids went unopposed. Throughout the 4th and 5th centuries, seemingly limitless funds poured into the coffers of the church, though actually that revenue was extracted from a diminishing tax base as citizens fled the towns to avoid the rapacious tax collectors. The bonanza intensified the ferocious infighting that had always characterized Christianity. Catholic versus Arian, Donatist versus Orthodox, Alexandria versus Constantinople, Milan versus Rome. In every imperial court, and there were now several, a coterie of bishops, female regents, and eunuchs vied for influence and power. Christianity, far from unifying the Roman world with a single faith, rent division and civil conflict throughout the empire. Yet the fanatical intolerance rampaged on, with increasingly more severe rescripts. Again and again, the pagan religions and the philosophies, that is, rational thought and science, were criminalized with the severest of penalties. The repetition of the legislation itself gives evidence that the populace of the empire had to be brought kicking and screaming to the Church of Christ. Yet every measure designed to crush and stamp out non-Christian belief met with renewed resistance, disaffection from the imperial cause, and civil commotion. In time, many would prefer the more tolerant rule of a barbarian king to the adolescent fanatics in Milan, Ravenna, or Constantinople. The campaign to wipe out heterodox opinion realized its zenith with the reign of Theodosius I, late in the 4th century. Barely a decade later, the city of Rome fell to the barbarians. The parasitic Christian religion had fatally weakened the host body. Yet as the Western Empire died, the psychosis of Christian faith had already migrated to the newcomers. Young lions, or effete fools, 13 Christian emperors who ruined the world. House of Constantine scramble for power. Constantine I, 307 to 337, age 34, on accession to throne in the West, 52 when he took command of the whole empire. With less than 5% of his subjects professing to be Christian, Constantine endorsed Christianity as the state religion. Though his Council of Nicaea was ever after hailed as the lodestone of Catholic orthodoxy, Constantine himself died an Arian at 65. Constantine II, 337 to 340, on accession in Gaul at the age of 21, Constantine's eldest son freed the fiery Trinitarian Bishop Athanasius from exile and allowed him to return to Alexandria in order to cause problems for his brother Constantius II. He was killed at age 24 in a battle with his brother Constans, trying to seize more territory. Constans I, 337 to 350. Age 17 on accession. Under the influence of Athanasius, he banned pagan sacrifice and waged a campaign against the Donatists in North Africa. He was persuaded to convene the Council of Serdica in order to deal with Arianism. Constans sold government posts to the highest bidder and was murdered by his disgruntled army chief at the age of 30. Constantius II, 337 to 361. On accession, age 20, he murdered many of his own family. His early life was influenced by Bishop Arius and his supporters. Quote, vain and stupid. He bankrupted the courier service by frequent calls for church councils. Ammianus. Terrified of sorcery, Constantius persecuted all the soothsayers and the Hellenists. Monks were exempted from public obligations shortly before his death at 44. Julian, 360 to 363, age 29 on accession, assassinated at 32. In vain, Julian had attempted to restore religious tolerance and the old gods. House of Valentinian, retreat into piety. Valentinian I, 364 to 375, 43 on accession. With Julian's murder and the death of Jovian, this stolid soldier made emperor, issued edict forbidding pagan officers to command Christian soldiers. He was impressed by Ambrose, whom he made Praetorian prefect of Italy, governor of Milan, and bishop. Little interested in religion, but hostile to the old pagan aristocracy, which cleared the way for Christian ascendancy. Died in a fit of anger at 54. His biggest mistake was making his obtuse brother Valens, 364 to 378, co-ruler in the East at 36. A zealous Arian, Valens ordered mass book burning and persecution of non-Christians throughout the Eastern Empire. His arrogance led him to defeat by the Goths in 378, age 50. Gratian, 367 to 383, 8 on accession, tutored by Ausonius, a Christian poet from Gaul. No interest in the rigours of military life, withdrew his capital from Trier to the relative safety of Milan, held in contempt by the army, murdered at 24 by Magnus Maximus, usurper emperor of western provinces, catspaw of Ambrose while he lived, abolished Vestal virgins, removed altar of victory. Valentinian II, 375 to 392, 4 on accession, regent Empress Justina. This child prince relied on Ambrose to negotiate with Maximus and remained a pawn in the power struggle between the Catholic bishop and his Arian mother. Intervention by Theodosius saved his throne, only to leave him under the thumb of Generalissimo Arbogastes, refused appeal to restore altar of victory, murdered or suicide at 19. House of Theodosius, Dissolute and Dissolution. Theodosius I, 379 to 395, 32 on accession. Sacked from the army by Valentinian I for cowardice. His seniority led a desperate 19-year-old Gratian to appoint him co-ruler for the East, after death of his uncle Valens. After a near-death experience at 34, he emerged as Catholic fanatic. Manipulated by Ambrose, he issued draconian anti-pagan laws. Any disagreement with Christian dogma was declared insane. Libraries looted and burned, temples closed and burned. Appointed General Stilicho as governor in the West for his younger son Honorius. Died at 49. Disastrous legacy. Arcadius, 395 to 408, 18 on accession, ruled ineffectually under Praetorian prefects Tatian, Rufinus and Anthemius, Chamberlain Eutropius, who appointed John Chrysostom patriarch, and forceful wife Eudoxia, who deposed Chrysostom, withdrew on her death, rarely leaving palace, urged the Goths to invade Italy to save his own skin, compensated for weak character with pious acts of religious intolerance, ordered that paganism be treated as high treason and any remaining temples be demolished, died at 31. Honorius, 395, 423, 10 on accession, murdered his protector, the brilliant General Stilicho, in 408 out of petulance and envy, paving the way for capitulation to German tribes migrating into Spain, Visigoths into southwest Gaul, and the loss of Britain. The feckless and timid youth abandoned Milan and Italy to the Goths while he cowed in Ravenna. Honorius stirred himself to call a synod of bishops and rule in favour of Boniface against rival Pope Eulalius, and tried to get Theodosius to return the Illyricum seized to the Roman bishop. A synod in Carthage declared the study of pagan books prohibited and issued an approved canon of the church. Honorius died at 38. Theodosius II, 408 to 450, 7 on accession, regent sister Empress Pulcheria. Early life dominated by his resolute and pious sister, his ambitious and pious wife Eudoxia, and the prefect Anthemius, who built the walls of Constantinople. Empress Pulcheria did much to advance the cult of imperial mystique, and in her brother's name proclaimed many edicts of intolerance. Pagans were banned from public and military posts. Synagogues and temples were destroyed. She also deposed Nestorius and returned John Chrysostom's bones to Constantinople. In June 423, Pulcheria declared that the religion of the pagans was nothing more than demon worship, and ordered all those who persisted in practicing it to be punished by imprisonment and torture. Pulcheria's rival, the emperor's wife Eudoxia, not to be outflanked in piety, went off to the Holy Land in 439 and returned with, quote, important relics to boost her own prestige. Eudoxia was eventually forced into exile in Jerusalem, where, in a new tactic, she embraced the cause of monophysitism, later adopted by her husband. When Theodosius eventually escaped female fetters, he disastrously gave in to Hun demands for ever more gold and conceded to the Vandals a fully independent kingdom in North Africa. Meanwhile, concentrating on really important matters, he convened the council at Ephesus in 449, the Robber Council, and declared for the monophysitic position that Christ had only one nature and it was divine, alienating Pope Leo I. This infamous book burner died at 49, falling from his horse. The Codex Theodosianus preserved his name. Valentinian III, 425 to 455, sixth on accession, regent, Empress Galla Placidia, owed his throne to intervention of Theodosius II in Western politics. A religious fanatic, under the influence of astrologers, he was subservient in turns to his mother, Generalissimo Aetius, and to Pope Leo I. He murdered Aetius, the last able general in the West, and was himself murdered at the age of 36. He lost the provinces of Africa, part of Spain, much of Gaul. The last Western emperors barely ruled Italy itself. Fathers of the Dark Age. Whilst the Roman Empire dissolved under the disastrous rule of weak and pious princes, real power passed into the hands of shrewd and scheming placemen of the church. Men of the old patrician class who had exchanged their togas for sacerdotal robes, these natural autocrats readily exerted coercion over effete, superstitious emperors sunk in crisis. Rivals for both territorial jurisdiction and supreme command, they vied with each other for the ear of the monarch. Fought, often quite literally, at church councils, and waged verbal war in the language of theology and dogma. Ambrose, raised to eminence by Valentinian, established a seat of episcopal authority at Milan. It was Ambrose who defined several cardinal features of Catholicism that would endure for more than 1,000 years, notably an hierarchical, disciplined and regimented organization, the subordination of women, and the dogma of the Trinity, a riposte to his Arian rivals. Quote, nothing can be found in this world more exalted than priests or more sublime than bishops. Ambrose can be credited with the invention and certainly the political use of saints, which would become such a feature of the age of superstition and ignorance which lay ahead. John Chrysostom made a name for himself for his demagogic oratory. Infamously, he recruited mobs of Gothic catechumen and armed monks and deployed them in the destruction of pagan shrines. This influential churchman of the Eastern Empire also set out to destroy the heritage of Greek intellectualism. "Empty your minds of secular knowledge," said Chrysostom. He would also have no truck with the allegorical method, which had long been used to accommodate the biblical message with Greek rationalism. Scripture was to be understood in a plain, literal sense, outlandish miracles and all. Prudish, an advocate of morbidly solemn liturgy, and a killjoy morality, Chrysostom contributed more than anyone to the anti-Semitism of the medieval church. Quote, "The pitiful and miserable Jews. Certainly it is the time for me to show that demons dwell in the synagogue, not only in the place itself, but also in the souls of the Jews." And this is what happened to the Jews. While they were making themselves unfit for work, they grew fit for slaughter. Against the Jews, Homily 1. Augustine. The contemporary of Chrysostom in the West, this saint's contribution to the darkness of medievalism was even greater. Quote, "Freedom is freedom to err." Fiercely intolerant of unbelievers and sectarians, Augustine urged the persecution of pagans, Donatists, and Pelagians. "The emperor has a duty to suppress schism and heresy," said Augustine, "and a stout blow should be used to compel conversion." Augustine was obsessed with the sin of lust and formulated the doctrine of original sin, which was the inescapable inheritance of mankind. Without the sprinkling of holy water, even infants would surely go to hell. Although Augustine could sanction just war in order to spread the loving word of Christ, his notion of predestination and the superiority of city of God eroded Roman self-confidence. Quote, "Since God knows everything, everything is predetermined by him forever." Gregory. This early pope and man of greatness perhaps did more than anyone to erase the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. Gregory ordered his bishops to desist from the wicked labour of teaching grammar and Latin to lay people. Gregory even forbade lay people from reading the Bible and ordered the burning of the Palatine Apollo Library in order that its secular literature would not distract from religious devotion. Sunk in ignorance, thousands of believers were readily deceived into purchasing expensive relics from Gregory himself, who legitimized the sacred bones by writing fantastic, miracle-filled lives of saints. To terrify the doubtful, demons filled the air and every dark corner. In an age of deprivation and poverty, Gregory accumulated vast papal wealth and landed estates. But Gregory was more than a venal churchman. He was devoted to Holy Mother Church. The clergy were given regalia and privilegia, and with the connivance of secular authority, supplanted the imperial civil service. Thus, all power and wealth was concentrated into the hands of the church. To ensure that it remained there, Gregory enforced a celibacy edict which prevented property from passing from the church to wives, families, or mistresses of the clergy. To ensure a regular flow of new income into the papal treasury, Gregory elaborated the notion of purgatory, an extortion racket which permitting the sale of indulgences for centuries. With the reforms of Pope Gregory, the church became thoroughly secular in nature. Wealthy noblemen chose the Pope, usually from among themselves, and illegitimate papal children were appointed cardinals. History's most successful criminal organization was in business.